Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome everybody into the webinar this morning where we're going to talk about finalizing invoices in our writer. So I'm going to start a new estimate. At the top of my screen, I'm going to use the icon there that says New EST. And as we do, it's going to ask me to search through my customer list. Again, I do my search, and if I've got an existing customer, we can use an existing customer, or we can add a new one. So if I go ahead and add in a new customer, and we'll give them a name, we'll give them an address, and then finally, we'll give them a phone number. And then we'll click on OK in the lower right-hand corner. He's a new customer, so we're going to want to give him a vehicle inside of the system if we knew a license plate and a state that was associated with. And we're using the Carfax integrated VIN lookup. We can go ahead and we can have it pull down year, make, model, and engine and add that in. So I've now got my vehicle information populated. So there's my VIN number, and finally my year, make, model, and engine as we go through. So we populate our vehicle information for our customer, and then we click on OK. Tells me that I've already used that license plate and or VIN number before. We'll go ahead and we'll continue forward using it for this example as well. So it takes us into our estimate window. Now in this window, again, I'm starting on my service request tab. So if I wanted to make sure my courtesy check was added, if I had any other elements I'd like to include, I could add those as well. When I get over to my parts and labor tab, as we went through our webinar earlier this week, we talked about utilizing the labor icon up here at the top. And if I wanted to add a simple job onto a transaction that's already pre-existing in my system, maybe we'll add a job to install the front disc brake pads and then click on OK. I want to add a part to go along with that. I'll go ahead and I'll click on part, and I do carry some brake pads in my inventory. So we'll grab the one that we want to add and then associate it with our job. And then again, click on OK. So again, how we'd add on a part and labor that are pre-existing, both the labor job in my inventory, in my configuration, and then the part in my inventory. And or if I wanted to add a labor job where I want to go ahead and I want to build that job as we're actually adding it onto the ticket. So as opposed to having that job pre-established in my system, if I just wanted to add that because it's something we need to for this particular customer, we'll add that. And if I knew the part number that we were going to include, I can include that as well. I can enter in my cost, have it define my selling price to the consumer, and then click on OK. So we've now built our job. Again, some more detail about that functionality in our previous webinars as we've gone through this series. Again, talking about starting transactions as well as adding parts and labor to a ticket. We've now arrived at the point to where we want to start talking about, well, it's time to send the customer on their way. Now, in this case, we just built an estimate for the customer. So we'd go back to Mr. Benson and get his approval to do the work. And once he does, we're going to convert it from an estimate down to a work in progress ticket down at the bottom of my screen. So we've got our ticket now in our work in progress status. What you'll notice is I still have a handful of different elements that are in red on this particular transaction. Anything that shows in red indicates to me that before we can finalize this transaction, we're going to have to enter in some additional information. Now, if I wanted to, I could go through each line individually and I could fill in whatever was required or deficient. So that way we can make sure that we're entering in all of that information. So for example, if I double click on the courtesy check, what I'll see inside of that courtesy check window is the missing piece of information is the technician that actually performed the service. As I click on my technician dropdown, I've got 3 techs that are working today. Bill Fosterman is the one that handled the courtesy check on that transaction. When I click on OK, it asks me, do you want to assign this technician to all parts and labor on this repair order? Now, whether it asks me that question or not is a configurable setting, meaning when we talk about in our webinar later this afternoon about some of the configuration elements, we'll go take a look at, well, how does it decide it's going to ask me that question? If I answer yes to this question, then it does exactly what it would imply. It'll go through and it will apply that technician to all of the different line items on this transaction. If I had different technicians working on this particular invoice and I wanted to assign each one individually, what I would do is I would answer no. And then that way, as it exits out, it's assigned Bill Fosterman to my courtesy check, but you'll notice my brake pad and my power steering pressure switch job still both in red because we're going to need to assign the technician to each as we go through. So again, you can either clean them up, or if we hit finalize, then the system is going to take us through and it's going to force us to enter in this information before we can finalize this transaction. Now I could clean them all up, go through each one individually, go to the brake pads and tell it that Bill also did the brake pads, and then from there say no to the question about assigning to each individual. It's the parts and the labor. We want to know not just who did the labor, but who would have replaced the parts as well. So you'll notice as I'm assigning different technicians, each time it's asking if I'd like to assign that technician. So if I wanted to have 2 different technicians on this repair order, then we would go through and we'd say no to that question each time. Bob Stevens was the one that did the power steering pressure switch. So now you can see that I've got Bob Stevens assigned versus Bill Fosterman. When it comes to the pressure switch itself, this was a part we were buying on the outside, not one that I had in my master inventory. So as I double click on this, you'll see that it asks me for some additional information beyond just who was the technician. Now it wants to know that as well, and we already know Bob Stevens is going to get credit for having replaced that power steering pressure switch. But it also wants to know, well, what department does this belong in? Now you'll notice there are certain things that are lit up in red on my screen, others that are blank that I'm not forcing entry. There is a configuration screen called required entries that we'll talk about in our later webinar, where we can define which elements are required. Meaning, in my case, I want to know the department. You may not find that to be an important or relevant piece. Now, I would encourage you to think otherwise. There's a ton of background processes that department helps to facilitate and control. However, again, if you didn't want to have that as a required entry, it wouldn't pop up in red. Over on my list on the right-hand side, if I'm going to put that into my department for bulk parts, and then over where it says supplier, you'll notice it wants to know, well, who am I buying that from? In this case, we're going to buy that from AC Delco. Also over here on the right-hand side, you'll notice it says invoice number and then post to AP. Now, whether or not you use accounts payable, again, is an individual choice. If you're going to use the accounts payable system, then what we do is we would recommend we lock the system down, so therefore your service advisors can't circumvent the accounts payable process. In this case, if I'm going to go post my accounts payable transaction for this particular piece, I can either click on post AP here, or when I get back over to my transaction, there's also a button that says post to AP here. If we click on post to accounts payable, first thing it wants to know was, well, who was my supplier? We'll put in AC Delco. We did buy it today. Their invoice number that was on the paperwork that came with that pressure switch was ACD 1234, and I do have a house account with AC Delco, so we'll leave that set to charge. Lower right-hand corner, I'll click on next because we're going to post this accounts payable transaction to a repair order for John Benson, and you can either highlight John and hit next, or you can double-click to take us into the actual detail. And it says there were 2 parts that we could potentially have purchased on the outside for this transaction. Again, either highlight, and in this case, that's an existing part already on the ticket, or double click on the one we want. We want to validate our cost, $25.70. We want to validate whether there was or wasn't a core associated with that we got charged for, and then click on OK in the lower right-hand corner. That was the only part we bought from AC Delco on this particular transaction. So we'll click on Done in the lower right-hand corner. And we have nothing else to post from AC Delco on this invoice, so I'm going to click on Post. And it asks if I'd like to print an invoice. When I talk about the AP detail receipt, which is what we're going to look at here, my explanation or my reasoning behind the AP detail receipt is you want to have some sort of physical validation that this has been posted into accounts payable. So if you don't have any other means to identify, print this out and staple it to the invoice that came from AC Delco. That way, every vendor invoice should have a piece of paper stapled to it. So that's an easy visual cue so that I can see exactly what's been posted into accounts payable. If you'd prefer not to print the piece of paper and you want to just have a, let's say, a rubber stamp that you stamp, and it just says posted in big red letters, and that way you can look at a stack full of invoices and know exactly which ones have or haven't. I'm perfectly fine with that. Just some way that as I look at a vendor invoice, I'll know whether it has or has not been posted into accounts payable. The only other reason I'd give you to print the AP detail receipt is when you go back to try to research. Well, I've got a discrepancy in my bill from AC Delco for the month, so I want to go ahead and try to figure out, well, did I not post something? Did I put the wrong amount in? Did they charge me for something we didn't buy? So having both pieces of paper, both the vendor invoice and the invoice from the RO Writer AP posting together, can make doing that research a little bit easier. But so again, we print that AP detail receipt. We somehow visually verify that that has been posted into accounts payable. And now if I went back and looked at my power steering pressure switch, in that lower right-hand corner, there's that vendor invoice number. Now again, whether or not you're utilizing accounts payable is a user definable or configurable setting. However, if you are, again, we're going to post our accounts payable, and now you'll notice nothing else in red on this particular transaction. And as I'm back at my estimate window, or my repair order window in this case, all of my parts and labor have been cleaned up because I no longer have any listed there in red. It's time to send our customer on the way. In the upper right-hand corner, we'll click on Finalize. When you click on Finalize, in my case, I've got it asking me to validate or put in a vehicle mileage. On that 2014 Ford Explorer, we've got 68,411 miles, and I'll click on OK. The only required element that I had to fill in as we finished the ticket, so it now takes me to my payment window, where it says $340.24 is my total, and it assumes we're going to do that all on a singular tender type, meaning $340.24, he gave us cash. I simply click on cash there on the right-hand side, and it drops down a pending payment into my payment window. If I want it, I'll hit Finalize, and that accepts the payment and lets me go print a final copy of an invoice for our customer. Now, if you made a mistake, so this customer said, you know what, I want to give you a check for a portion of the repair and then a credit card or two for the balance of it. If you've made a mistake, all we have to do at this point is hit cancel. That Finalize button is kind of the point of no return. What I mean by that is anything we've done to this point, if I clicked on cancel to close back out of here, I could just click on Finalize, hit OK to validate the mileage, and come back in here. That pending payment goes away. So again, just my word of advice would be, before you click on Finalize, just make sure that everything's okay. If you wanted to, you could at the bottom, pardon me, print a preview copy of an invoice. So if you wanted to see, well, what's the actual printed document going to look at before I actually spool it off to the printer. But in our case, my example was, well, he wants to give us a check for a portion of it. He's going to write us a check for $100. Now you'll notice check amount $340.24. Well, that doesn't work. If I'm going to split the payment, what I first have to do is tell it that this is how much I'm going to do with each tender type. So we'll say $100 on a check. Again, how much was the check? And then if you wanted, you could capture your check number and your authorization if you're putting that through some sort of clearinghouse. So we can put our authorization in there as well and click on OK. If you're not using any sort of check validation service, then those values can be left blank, whether they are required or not, meaning should they be lit up in red. Again, a user definable option over in configuration. I also said, well, we'll take some of that on a credit card. So I clicked on credit card. Now again, it assumes the entire tender amount that's outstanding, $240.24. If we were going to split that again, we could say, well, let's put $100 again onto a specific credit card. Visa, MasterCard is my most popular. So that's the one that I've got in the top of my list. Over again, I wanted to put in the last 4 digits, and if I'm walking over to that standalone terminal, and we're going to put in our authorization from the terminal and then click on OK. Now, just a side note as we go through, we do have an integrated credit card processing functionality inside of RO Writer as well through 2 different processing companies, one called OpenEdge, one called Merchant Partners. If you're interested in learning more about either, feel free to send us an email to the training@rowriter.com inbox, and we'll be happy to either send you information or get you in contact with someone that can discuss our integrated credit card solutions. If you were using those, as opposed to credit cards, there'd be a button there that says e-payment, and then underneath that, there would be a button that says other credit cards, because not every credit card transaction or every payment transaction that we're using may or may not go through that electronic payment piece. Notice I have two other options. One says charge to a third party, and then another one says one-time charge. So these buttons and whether they exist, a user-definable setting. If I was going to try to do either, in my case, I've got them set up with a password, a security level that says not just anybody can go ahead and either charge something to an accounts receivable account or charge something to another accounts receivable account. Now, again, we could actually change one of these buttons. We could take them both away, or we could change what one says, meaning if we opened an account for this customer, then we could go ahead and we could have that one that says charge to AR or accounts receivable. We're not going to go too deep into that in today's conversation, but again, we do have accounts receivable functionality inside of the program that we could take advantage of as well. In my example, I said we were going to split that into a second credit card. So we'll make it discover, and it will be for the balance. And we'll put, again, our last four digits and our authorization as we went through and swiped that through, and click on OK. Now that we have told it how we're paying for the entire amount of the invoice, lower right-hand corner, we would click on Finalize. When I click on Finalize, it asks me if we'd like to print a final repair order. Odds are pretty good we're going to want to print that final repair order. And again, we've got four different options on Gen 2. One of the differences Gen 2 versus Gen 1 is Gen 2 will let you spit it right to a PDF, and or if you want, we could email to screen or printer. These three exist with Gen 1 as well. I'm going to print mine to the screen and then click on OK. So then now we get our printed copy down here that we could take a look at. Again, different variations on the theme in terms of the actual invoice itself. There's my split payments that'll be there down the left-hand side. This is a little bit of an older version of an invoice form I was testing with or playing around with, not necessarily what we're typically using today. As we finalize that invoice, one last question. It says, do you wish to schedule an appointment for this customer and vehicle? Again, the concept here is, do we want to schedule that next touch point? Maybe there was declined work that we want to make sure that we get on the schedule to have them come back and have done. Or maybe we did some maintenance services. We want to make sure that, let's say that next oil change happens, or we at least contact them 3 months, 4 months, 5 months down the road, somewhere in there. So again, do you want to schedule an appointment for this customer and vehicle? Again, our purpose today, not to get into a conversation about scheduling appointments. So I'm going to say no to that question, but whether it asks me that question or not, also a configurable item that we'll discuss in our webinar talking about some of the config elements surrounding the Finalize window. The other topic we had as part of this conversation was looking at history. To the upper left-hand corner, you'll notice there's an icon there that says history. There's actually a menu that says history. By default, when you just click on the history icon, it goes to what's called local history. So we're going to do that first. If I went into the history icon, we'll pull up that invoice that we just looked at, in this case, John Benson and his 2014 Ford Explorer. So it takes us back in, and it starts on what's called the repair order tab. If I just wanted to see the labor that was on there, I could go to labor history. I wanted to see the parts, I could go to the part history. Now, in this case, we only have a single transaction. So again, not really too much to worry about trying to find in our consolidated history, parts, and labor. If I wanted to see the repair order itself as it existed that day when we finalized it, either double click on it, or when it's highlighted, hit display repair order, and then now it'll put it together just like we just saw in our estimate window, where we were looking at the parts and labor on this particular transaction. Drill into either one deeper as you go along. We're going to install the front brake pads, and you'll notice while it would seem like we could change some of these values, the only one we can actually change and have it take effect would be our technician. If that was assigned to the wrong technician, I needed to assign it to a different technician. I could select a different technician, and again, you'll notice that I have that password protected. Not anybody can go in and change the assigned technician. That is the only value in either the part or labor window that you can change after we finalize the transaction, is the technician it was assigned to. Had I changed anything about, let's say, the description, and again, we're just going to add on just a little bit to the back end, and then went back in, you'll notice that not only did it not ask me for a password or a security level, it did not actually save any of that. It threw that away as I went to save that particular line. So again, it's just changing the technician that's available for us to change in history. At the top, if I wanted to see if there were any recommended services, either through the checklist and or through declined items, if there were anything, or if I wanted to see what the checklist looked like as I went through it that day, or if I wanted to reprint a copy of that invoice, all done through that top header as we go through. Take a look at a different example as far as history is concerned. Somebody that's got a little bit more extensive history with us. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just pull it up by invoice number. And you'll notice we've got 7 different finalized invoices and then a few different estimates we've built over the course of time as well. This might be an example where we might use the part and or labor history a little bit more extensively. If I looked at that labor history, here are all the different labor items that are on that. And if I looked at the part history, again, here are all of the different parts that are there. You'll notice there's a search option in the upper right-hand corner of each. If I said, well, let's go take a look and let's see when we've done something with the drivetrain, and it says, well, we have one invoice that had drivetrain labor on it, and it was this invoice on this day. If I'd like to see it, I just click Display Repair Order. Now it's going to bring that up to the screen. And again, in this case, there's my drivetrain labor job. So again, we're doing keyword searches as we go through. So when we got a little bit more extensive history, and that makes it a bit easier for me to find that history as we go along. A couple last items as it relates to history. Back to the upper left-hand corner, I mentioned that there was a drop-down menu here. Local history, again, that's the same as just clicking on the history icon. Reprint history says, well, we're going to allow you to reprint history for a length of time for repair order estimates and or both. So if I said I'd like to reprint all of today's invoices, then I could go ahead and go to reprint history, and I could reprint all of the invoices that were finalized on any given day. If I went back to history and I said, let's look at service history, what this does is with that same Carfax VIN lookup piece, how about we put in a license plate, let's see, that's not right, how about 1749770 with the state of Illinois, and I say, well, let's go ahead and let's look up that history, my license. What this does is this takes us out to the Carfax service history check for that vehicle, and I can see when a particular service was performed on that vehicle. So again, if we were to use the drop-down menu, 3 different options: local history, reprint history, and or service history as we go through. So again, different than just looking up the history itself. We can reprint for a day, or we can go to Carfax and pull that up through the service history.